Hello, psychology students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have your notes for Module 15, Adolescence. And the other day we began, and you probably are about a little ways into your first page. We're going to continue where we left off in class. So let's begin. Sexual orientation. This is the enduring sexual attraction towards people of other genders. Heterosexuality is that. If the sexual attraction is towards the same gender, then it is homosexuality. A number of studies suggest that somewhere between 3 to possibly 4% of all men and possibly 1 to possibly 2% of all women are exclusively homosexual. When we look at percentages, about 1% of the population is identified as being bisexual. Studies have not been able to establish that homosexuality is related to parenting styles, a person's hatred or fear of the opposite sex, or even a childhood history of being raised by or exploited by homosexual adults. Sexual orientation, though, may be a result of some biological factors, and some studies suggest that there are some differences when we look at the brains, particularly the hypothalamus of heterosexuals compared to those of homosexual orientation. Cognitive development in adolescence. You know, we talked a little bit about Jean Piaget when we talked about infancy and childhood development, but Piaget was a pioneer in studying developmental psychology, and he introduced the different stages of cognitive development in children. And when we talk about adolescence, we kind of have to start focusing in kind of on the last stage, and that is formal operations. So when we talk about reasoning, developed during the formal operational stage, when we develop adult thinking and reasoning, formal logic or abstract thinking or hypothetical reasoning are now possible. And these changes represent a qualitative change in cognitive skills. By adolescence, most young people will have the mental tools to take on these abstract concepts. And according to David Elskind in 1978, this is also an age when one tends to focus on the self, often imagining that one's own feelings are particularly unique. This focus on the self might make some adolescents prone to impulsive behavior or possibly risk-taking. The adolescent brain, for the most part, is kind of in a developmental stage for kind of rewiring the frontal lobes, and this is largely responsible for long-term planning and impulse control. What we now know is that during adolescence, this is still kind of under construction, and for the most part, won't be fully mature until an individual is roughly in their mid-20s. Morality. A man named Lawrence Kohlberg created 3 stages of moral development, and his theory of moral reasoning demonstrates how our way of thinking about moral situations changes with our level of development. So our levels are kind of progressing from kind of simple moral reasoning to more complex moral reasoning. So we're going to start with the simple, what is known as the pre-conventional moral reasoning. And the individual, for the most part, is concerned solely with themselves. It's a very primitive level of moral reasoning characterized by a desire to avoid punishment or to gain some kind of reward. So most children under the age of 9 show this type of moral reasoning. And even some adults never progress beyond this level. So an example would be, I'm not going to do this because I can get in trouble. Or I'm not going to do this because I'm going to be punished. That is, for example, pre-conventional moral reasoning. When we get beyond that, we end up with what we call conventional moral reasoning. And this is a concern about fitting in. And primarily the concern for conventional moral reasoning is to fit in and to play the role of the good citizen. So, if a good citizen is going to do good things, meaning that they're going to help others, they're going to become civically involved, all this. And people at this level have a strong desire to follow the rules and laws of society. So if the law of the land says you can't do something, then you're not going to do it. Conventional moral reasoning is typical of most adults. The final stage is what we call post-conventional moral reasoning. And the concern is with a broader ethical principle. Most people don't reach this level. So, post conventional moral reasoning is characterized by a reference to universal ethical principles that represent the rights or obligations of all people. So, it might be looking at certain levels of fairness in society. If we went back in time and we talked about suffrage, the right to vote, there have been many times when the right to vote in the United States has been denied, either based on gender, when women weren't allowed to vote, or based on race. And so somebody from this post-conventional moral reasoning would probably look at that and say that is morally wrong. So it's a higher ethical principle. I kind of think about it in terms of like things like civil disobedience, that you're willing to break the law to bring about something better in the long run. So that's Kohlberg. Social development in adolescence. And just so you know, we've talked a little bit about Erik Erikson, and he came up with an H-stage theory of social development. His theory illustrates how certain issues peak during different periods of life, including adolescence, and he divided the lifespan into 8 stages, ranging from infancy to late adulthood. And in each of the stages that we go through in the psychosocial development, there is some type of task. And the task, for the most part, is a challenge. And the way that the individual handles this task or challenge may lead to a more desirable or a less desirable outcome. So, for example, if you look at the chart here, in infancy, our big challenge or crisis is to trust or to mistrust. So, if a baby cries, it's hoped that maybe somebody will come to the care of the infant. But if no one comes, then the infant might develop a sense of mistrust. And as we get older, we go through different stages. Early childhood, autonomy versus shame and doubt. A lot of this is kind of centered around like toilet training, whether or not you have, the skills to feel independent, or, are you going to be made to feel like you're lesser than yourself? When we get into like the latter part of like grade school, industry versus inferiority. Can you learn the task that your teachers or your coaches want you to do, or will you ever, forever, never accomplish those goals and be inferior? Okay. By the time we get to adolescence, we're going to hit a few big ones: identity versus role fusion, and then eventually in young adulthood, intimacy versus isolation. So let's talk about identity. And your identity is that sense of self, according to Erik Erikson. An adolescent's task is to solidify a sense of self by testing and integrating various roles. So it's not uncommon that sometimes adolescents will, at one point in time, dress in a certain style or listen to a certain type of music because they assume that that's the role that they want to portray. And maybe they'll even wear their hair a certain way. Okay. That's all about trying to find their identity. And according to Erikson, the adolescent's task is to solidify that sense of self by testing and integrating various roles. The search for identity during adolescence has several different characteristics. There's experimentation. So you might experiment in healthy ways, like maybe trying a variety of activities at school. So maybe you go out for one act, not knowing if you could act, or go out for speech, not knowing if you can get in front of a crowd to talk. Maybe going out for a certain sport, just to find out whether or not you have the talent to be successful in that. You might also observe various adult role models. You might even imagine your life in a variety of different careers. Okay. There's also the rebellion. And this is the part that probably gets parents really upset. But um, healthy development includes building some independence. And that may mean pulling away from like your parents a little bit and kind of testing the waters. So most parents have an image of what their children should become, and most children maintain um, some kind of core value as their parents, but teens may test certain limits with their parents by adopting certain styles of fashion, or maybe grooming a certain way, like growing your hair long, or maybe if you're a guy, growing some whiskers that maybe parents and a lot of other adults may not understand or even accept. Along with that, there's a little bit of selfishness when we talk about relationships. Sometimes it's not about like, being, kind of into other people, but it's all about being into yourself. And sometimes it can become very self-centered, a little egotistic in a sense. Teens increasingly learn about their unique self as they move in and out of various friendships. Oops, there we go. Relationships, cliques, and sometimes romances. So it's not uncommon that you might see someone who is in their adolescence who's dating, um, going with someone and then breaking up and then immediately turning around and dating somebody else, kind of like a serial dater in a sense. That's not uncommon when we talk about this concept of the selfishness. Teen friendships are typically genuine and important, but they also sometimes tend to be very temporary. So you might have some friends in high school, but as you transition into college and maybe adulthood, you might not take all those friendships with you. Some of those may kind of fade away, and new ones are going to blossom that might be actually stronger than the previous ones. So some people do maintain lifelong friendships with some of their high school friends, but most adults will find that these friendships become kind of fond memories as time goes on, as they settle into careers and family patterns in the years to come. This is also a time of optimism and energy. Most teenagers are armed with a lot of new and more powerful thinking skills or cognitive skills, and they view the world with a fresh and maybe even a refreshing perspective, that optimism that's there. And many adolescents are willing to tackle serious issues related to human rights, the environmental concerns, political campaigns, and other causes. If a kid in their teen years survives the role confusion and finds who they are, then we're ready to move to Erickson's next stage. And we're going to talk about developing intimacy. And according to Erickson, intimacy is the ability to form those close and loving and open relationships, which is really kind of the primary task of early adulthood. Many people have their most intense and intimate relationships with their spouse, but not all marriages achieve this type of closeness. Intimacy is not necessarily sexual by nature. We have to kind of move beyond that. It's sometimes it is like how you can talk to other people and how you can share information. And sometimes it does occur outside of marriage with a close friend or even some family members. So young adults facing this challenge of intimacy versus isolation, if you're a person who is very isolated, you cannot share yourself honestly and openly with others. And you might be still confused a little bit about your sense of self as a result of that. So as we move on, usually during this stage, there's a certain amount of independence from your family. Children move from primary attachments of their parents to primary attachments of their peers. And you can observe this really in any setting where there's young people. It might be a mall, it might be at a school, it might be at a sporting event. But a lot of times, you'll see parents interacting with their smaller children, and then parents, for the most part, watch from a distance their interactions with their teenagers. As children become adolescents, arguments with parents do tend to become a little bit more frequent and a little more intense. It's not necessarily the end of the world by any means, but most of the time, parents and teens do get along quite well. And with about 97% of American teens, when they were surveyed, they reported that they get along fairly well or very well with their parents. And more than half of all middle class teenagers in the world, um, or at least in this worldwide survey, say that their family relationships are some of the most important guiding principles in their life. Thank you very much.